Lesson number 12, the Constitutional Convention. So in the last lesson and topic, we looked at the Articles of Confederation, and the main thing that I wanted you to realize about the Articles was that they weren't very good, and that the people that were running the United States at the time realized that the Articles of Confederation just weren't going to cut it, and that there needed to be some changes to that document, and eventually that desire for change to the Articles of Confederation is going to lead to the creation of the U.S. Constitution. So the Constitutional Convention was a meeting to fix the Articles and kind of amend them and change them around a little bit, but it evolved into creating a whole new document, which we know today as the U.S. Constitution. So our goals today are the things you'll be able to do. You'll be able to discuss compromises made at the Constitutional Convention. That's going to be the big focus of this lesson, and that was what the big focus at the convention was eventually. There was a lot of people, remember we talked about those two groups, that kind of didn't see eye to eye on things. There's a bunch of other splits on topics as well. So the convention is going to be a whole lot of compromises, a whole lot of things where people reached a middle ground, where two groups kind of wanted different things, and they met in the middle for the sake of creating the United States, because they realized that if they didn't compromise, then the United States as we know it might not exist. So the big focus of the convention is going to be compromise. What you're going to look at in the assignment after this lesson, and you can think about it while we're going through this video, is how did the compromises uphold or violate the principles? So some of the compromises you'll be able to argue were good for the principles we've been talking about: liberty, justice, and equality. Some of them you could probably argue that they weren't so good for liberty, justice, and equality, that they violated those principles. So while you're looking at the compromises in this video lesson, try and think about that. Try and think about, does this compromise promote or uphold liberty? Does it promote or uphold justice? Does it promote or uphold equality? And then the same thing with violate. Does it violate any of the principles, liberty, justice, and equality? So the initial thing is there's going to be two groups that kind of form the Constitutional Convention. A lot of people look at these two groups kind of like the first political parties in the country. They're the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were the people that wanted like a strong central government. They wanted the government to have a good amount of power. And the Anti-Federalists wanted a government that wasn't as strong, and they wanted power to lie more with the states and with local governments. So a lot of the compromise is going to be about the two of them, and those two sides kind of meeting halfway on things. Now this is where I really want you to start paying attention when you see the word compromise. That's going to be the important information that I want you to understand. So there's going to be three issues that you see, and each issue I'm going to discuss it, and then underneath of the issue there's going to be, like you see on this screen right now, there's going to be what the compromise was, what the two sides kind of decided was going to be the compromise, or the way things were going to be. The compromise part, that's what I really want you to think about when you're thinking about liberty, justice, and equality. In what way do they uphold or violate any of those principles? So the first problem, like you remember from the Articles of Confederation, is there's no president, there's no executive, there's nobody that's in charge of the country. The government's basically made up of one legislature, or one group that basically does everything, including make laws. There's nothing to really check up on that legislature. So you need a way to keep that legislature in check. But you don't want to create something that's going to be like a king. So that's what everyone's afraid of. People realize that having just one group making laws might not be a good thing, because it might get too powerful. But people are still very afraid of putting somebody in a very powerful position because of all their experiences with the King of Britain. So what do? Compromise is this. There can be a president, but the person cannot make laws. So the president does not have the power to create laws. The president still does not have power to create laws to this day, despite what many people think. The president only gets to stay president for 4 years. This way they can't become like a king, because they can't stay the president for that long. They can be reelected after those 4 years, but they have to keep winning the elections. They don't just keep keep being president just because they got voted in once. The Electoral College chooses the president, not the people. So the way that it worked was people would kind of vote, and it was more of a suggestion of how they think their state should vote in terms of who gets to be the president. The Electoral College would actually get to pick the president. And that's technically still the way we do things today. Technically, we do not pick the president. We suggest to the Electoral College, which is something we're going to get into later, who we want our state to vote for. The president and Congress have ways to stop the other. So there's checks and balances. So they set it up so the president has some powers over Congress, over the legislature, and vice versa. The Congress has powers over the president. This way, if one of the groups, or in the case of the president, if one of the sides does something wrong, the other side has a way to stop that action or stop that thing that they did wrong. So, for example, if Congress passed a law and the president felt that it was incredibly unfair or unjust, the president could veto the law or make it so it wasn't going to be a law. That's an example of a check and balance. So that was issue 1. So the compromise is what you should be focusing on, and if you need to take a screenshot or use your snipping tool to take that information down, now would be a good time to do so. Another issue, if you remember from the articles, every state got one vote, which a lot of people thought wasn't fair because some states were bigger than others. So larger states would have the same amount of votes as a small state. So if you had 1 million people in one state and you had 10 people in another state, they'd both get the same amount of votes. Doesn't make sense. You'd have one vote for 1 million people, but then one vote for 10 people. Just doesn't make sense. So they have to figure out a way to make it more fair in terms of population. Problem with that is smaller states are a little afraid of that because they feel like if it's only based on population, that the big states are going to dominate everything and their voices are never going to be heard since they're small states. So they reach a compromise. The compromise is this. There's 2 plans that kind of combine them together. One's called the New Jersey plan. One is called the Virginia plan. New Jersey was a small state. Virginia was a big state. So the Virginia plan makes it so there's a legislature or a part of Congress that is based on population. The more people you have in your state, the more votes or representatives you get. The New Jersey plan sets up something where the legislature is equal for all states. That's what the U.S. Senate is today. Each state gets 2 senators or 2 representatives. So when you combine them together, and it was known as the Great Compromise, you have something that satisfies the desires of the big states. The Virginia plan, which meant that Congress was based on population in one part of it. And then you had the New Jersey plan, where all the states were equal regardless of population. So you keep them both happy. That's the idea of compromise. Last thing, slavery. Slavery had been banned in some places at the time. This is way before the Civil War. Almost 100 years before the Civil War. So slavery is still legal in the United States, but there are some places where it's been banned or made illegal. Southern states, which are the ones that owned slaves, they were afraid of the new government. They thought that this new government might, since they've banned slavery in some places, might start to regulate or change slavery across the whole country. So the southern states were a little afraid that if they agreed to this constitution, that they might have to end up giving away their slaves, and that slavery might be made illegal, or that slavery might be regulated or changed in some way. So they're afraid of that. So there's a compromise on this. The new government would revisit the issue in 1808, so about 20 years later or so. They would look back at the issue of slavery and decide what to do. When the number of votes, the other thing was, I'm going to slow down to explain this one. The other thing was, the southern states, even though they treated their slaves as property and not really as people, they wanted the slaves to count when it came to determining how many representatives they got in Congress. Because remember, the more people that live in your state, the more votes, more representatives you get in Congress. So the southern states want to count the slaves as people, as part of their population. In order Southern states say that's ridiculous. You treat them as property, you don't treat them as people. So they should not count as part of your population. So the compromise they reach is to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. So what that means is when you're counting the population of a southern state, you do not count the slave as one person. You would count the slave as 3/5 of a person. I know this is horrible, and believe it or not, I'm not making this up. This was part of the Constitution. So 3 non-slaves, so 3 people that were not slaves, they would count the same amount as 5 slaves would. So you would basically be counting slaves as less than one person. That was the compromise. You might be saying to yourself, my gosh, how could they possibly do that? How could they not only try and talk about all these principles, liberty, justice, and equality in a country that had slavery, but then they have a chance to kind of stop it, and they didn't. What happened? They realized that if they didn't compromise on this issue, that the country may have never existed. So in the interest of, and remember, this isn't my opinion, this is what I'm justifying or trying to tell you what the people that founded the country were thinking at the time. They realized that if they don't compromise on the issue, then the southern states might not approve the Constitution, and there might not have been a United States. So they realized that they needed to compromise on the issue for now and revisit it later, which they do, but much later, unfortunately. So to recap, there's a little kind of summary of the compromises up on the board. You can take another screenshot if you want to, if that's easy for you. In the assignment that you're going to do with this, you're going to be answering the question that's at the bottom there, where it says, do these compromises reflect the principles, liberty, justice, and equality? So you'll have to kind of talk about whether or not these compromises, it can be some do, it can be some don't. It doesn't have to be like yes they do or no they don't. You can be in the middle when you're talking about your answer to this question. You just need to show me why you picked what you did. So if you think they all reflect the principles, that's fine. You just need to defend it and discuss why. If you think that none of them reflect the principles, you just need to discuss it and explain why. If you think it's kind of in the middle, some of them promote the principles, some of them violate the principles, that's fine too. Just make sure you explain it and defend it. If you need help with this one, just let me know. It's going to be a little bit longer of an assignment than you're used to. That's why it's one of the only ones for the week. But if you have any questions, let me know. If not, good luck.